everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. I am Katie, joined by the one and only John J. Wall, Chief,
Hello.
Chief Statistician of Trust Insights, all around swell guy.
I'm here. I've got the numbers. We can make it happen.
This week, Chris is at the Maycon event in Cleveland. He took the stage this morning to really great reception and feedback. He was talking about the future of marketing using large learning models. So definitely check that out if you can. Any of the replays, you can also go to wherecanigettheslides.com and check out his talk there. So today, John and I are talking about how to be a good podcast guest. Now, this is a topic that people, when we posted, oh, and there goes my light. When we posted that this was going to be our topic this week, a lot of people have expressed interest because we often talk about making a podcast and how to be a good host and what questions to ask in the interview. But we thought we would sort of flip it to the reverse of what if you're asked to be on a podcast? How do you continue to ask to be asked to be on podcasts? And so, John, because you have 15 years of podcasting experience. You started when you were 15.
Right. Unfortunately, I'm still having to podcast. Had I, done this right, I'd already be wealthy and retired, but here we are.
So we'll talk about lessons learned, dealing with a bad podcast host. So if you're a guest and the host is just kind of sucking wind, how to salvage it so that you still have a good interview, and then how to measure your performance as a podcast guest. This was one that people expressed a lot of interest in, of what the heck does that even mean? So, John, as an OG podcaster, where would you like to start today?
Yeah, well, it's, this, as we always do, right? You have to back up a bit to your strategic reasons, like, why are you doing this? And, what are your 5 Ps? Like, you need to sit down and say, okay, yeah, it's great to do podcasts, but why are you doing this? Like, what's the goal? Are you just trying to get your voice out there? Are you trying to push a product? Are you trying to promote something else you've got going? Is it more to learn about a specific vertical or to become established as an expert there? So, and all of that stuff changes everything that happens downstream, because for some things, like if you're promoting a book, like, you don't care. You will just get on every single podcast with every, Tom, Dick, and Harry and talk about anything with anybody as long as they get the link right to the book. Whereas if you're trying to prove expertise, or you have a specific cause or view of the world that you want to get out there, you really want to take the time to make sure that you're matched with the right platform and the right audience. And yeah, it's funny, you had a lot of people wanting to hear more about, how to handle a host or how to deal with bad questions and all that kind of stuff. And again, that's strategic too. You kind of have to look at these as they come in, or look to the ones you're going to reach out to and say, is this the right one for me? Like, how am I going to handle this? How am I going to deal with it? And I mean, it even gets crazier too. If you're doing more mainstream stuff, like, there are guests and shows where you're expected to fight and disagree and have a, bad experience, which is more because it's for the entertainment of the people watching. So yeah, there's a bunch of places to go, but I guess we can definitely start with 5 Ps. Are there stories that you think are closest to what we want to talk about today, as far as where people need to go?
Yeah. So, and I think you're where you mentioned, John, of what is the purpose of doing these interviews in the first place is really important. When we first started Trust Insights, I thought that I needed to be doing just as many interviews as Chris for awareness, but I didn't have a strong story to tell at that time. And so it was hard because I would get on these podcasts and the first thing that people would ask me about was Chris. And that wasn't necessarily the right story because it wasn't really talking about the company. It was just sort of talking about, people were curious about Chris Penn, the futurist, the speaker. And so I had to take a step back. I had to really dig deep and figure out, what is the purpose of Katie Robert being interviewed on a podcast, Katie Robert being on a stage talking about something. And it took a couple years for me to really figure out what my story was and how it benefited the company. And so the purpose for me is to drive awareness to the company for marketers and other professionals who are trying to understand technology, but not in a futuristic way, but in a more pragmatic, what do I need to do today kind of way. So I look at myself as the 101 version of the really advanced technology, not in a, I'm catering to a lesser audience, but in a way that I'm trying to represent people who are newer to a lot of these concepts.
Yeah, and that's right at the heart of what we face with so much of this stuff. As a marketer, we see this all the time is that, the audience is irrational, right? Like
Mhm,
we definitely thought many times we were like, well, we have the Trust Insights way of doing things that Chris Penn has helped put together. Basically, any of us can go and talk about this process because it's the first 20 steps you take. It's not the
mhm,
stuff way out in the horizon that Chris works on as side projects. It's all there. But what, yeah, we just run into over and over again is like, yeah, people will pay $20,000 to get Chris. But if anybody, you or I are like, well, we actually do the exact same deck and we'll do it for $5,000. They're like, yeah, no, we really want Chris Penn to come. They just have that celebrity mindset. Um,
mhm,
and then they have ulterior motives too, right? A lot of them, maybe they don't care at all about the topic. They're looking at Chris's 225,000 Twitter
mhm,
followers and they're like, this could really promote our event. Him saying he's speaking, we're actually buying advertising. Like, it has nothing to do with, having him on the show or whatever. So yeah, you make a great point in that having your red thread, that Tamsin Webster talks about as far as here's, why I speak. This is what I do. This is where we go. And that gives you a solid map for where the next stop should be. So classic one for me is always marketing over coffee related stuff, right?
mhm,
So as host of Marketing Over Coffee, I am always looking for opportunities to further promote the show and highlight the expertise of not only myself but Trust Insights and you, being you and Chris. So there's a clear map of where to go to that. Like, I'm not going to hit a bunch of other marketing podcasts to talk about what they've got on, right? The idea is that I go on to the sewing podcast where they decide to do their once a year episode on what's happening in marketing for sewing people, for tailors and for, whatever. But you bring a different message and a different story and it makes you a valuable guest. So it's not that you're kind of rehashing or challenging your hosts for expertise.
mhm.
You're going in a very specific and clear direction. And, and then the easy 5P one is like, I have my new book. I need to sell more copies. So I'm going to be on all these podcasts. And then that one is a different approach. That one you will go on every single marketing podcast and
Mhm.
just not be promoting your own podcast. It's not competitive. You're saying, hey, here's my book, go get the book, download the first chapter, do all this stuff. So yeah, what you want to accomplish definitely does set up the dominoes for figuring out who to deal with. And if you're going to take a project, if you're going to ask, or if you're asked if you're going to take it.
So you've been interviewing guests for, a very long time on Marketing Over Coffee. So sometimes it's you and Chris, and you have a really easy rapport back and forth. You sort of know when to pick up and put down the conversation with each other and give each other sort of that equal airtime. But when you have a guest, what are some of the guests that things that your guests on your show have done wrong that have caused you to sort of heavily edit the show? And I would imagine that one of the things is not knowing when to stop talking.
Yeah, but it's the key thing is it's just like the same as on being the guest side is that as the host, you have to do all your homework. Like
Mhm,
no, for Marketing Over Coffee, nobody gets invited on the show if I haven't at least heard the person on another podcast or watched a YouTube video or something. Like, I already know that they can speak coherently. They don't have to have done 20 keynotes, but I at least I'm going to watch some things and say, okay, yeah, this person can represent themselves and present themselves. And then we have it good in that, we're covering marketing and tech, and we're usually always dealing with professionals. So I have never had anybody that couldn't just like give their introduction and make their pitch and, kind of get people in the right direction. But if you're not, as lucky as us to have people that are already running their mouths as a profession, the thing you do with guests is it's unfortunately, everybody thinks so much of podcasting is supposed to be organic and just off the cuff, but it's really prep and rehearsal. You sit down with the guest beforehand, and I do this a lot with our guests, even though they're pros with what they do. I say, okay, look, we have the big story, and it's like for a lot of authors, it's like, okay, so you have this new book out about organizational behavior and management. And I, having read your book, here's the 5 things that I think are the biggest things, and I'm going to
Mhm.
hit you in order with these. And I even have it mapped out. We have a tried and true thing of we shoot for around 25 minutes because that's the average commute or gym, treadmill workout or whatever. And it's broken into 3 acts. We have, there's kind of an intro to establish what's going on, and then dive deep in the second part to, kind of set up some conflict or figure out what the challenges are and how they solve them. And then third part is a wind down, and we always close on something more personal and individual to highlight them as as a full human being, not just like some kind of business machine. And they know that there's going to be breaks between those 2 slots. That's where the sponsor slots go, 2 60-minute slots. And even as far as reviewing the sponsors with them, hey, have you ever done any business with LinkedIn? Are you running any LinkedIn ads? Do you want to chime in? Because we, seen and proven that these organic ads where people just kind of say, oh yeah, I use HelloFresh. Those meals are great. We love them too. Like that makes for great sponsorship opportunity. And in a perfect world, if it's something that actually leads into content that you're talking about that's worthwhile and educational, that's just a complete killer. It basically makes the advertisement invisible. It doesn't slow the conversation at all. So yeah, lining up what the big story is going to be, having the list of questions. And I go as far as I have a Google Doc that I do for every interview. And
Mhm.
I say to them, look, you have full edit rights to this. Like, go ahead and change it. And for like, I don't know, like most people who are doing event prep, at first I was like, oh my God, do I really want to give them access to this whole thing? But Google Docs does have full version control. Like you can go back and say, okay, show me the changes they made last week. So you can just go in
Mhm.
and scan and see what they've messed up and what they've deleted. You have to be mindful of if there's topics that they're not going to want to talk about, can't talk about, whatever. Um, but yeah, so having that written plan and rehearsing a little bit. Yeah, I rarely have to go as far as setting up a dry run, but sometimes, especially if their gear is questionable, you might want to even say like, okay, here's the StreamYard link. Let's hop on at 1:00 tomorrow and just hop on and answer a few questions or whatever. Just make sure that their video's good, their lighting's good, their sound's good, that they kind of know what the heck they're doing. And if they're working with a PR person, the PR person can jump in and you don't have to take the heat for that. You can just say to the PR person, look, get them a good microphone or
Mhm.
get their lighting fixed, because we want them to look as good as we can. And then as far as running your mouth too long, that's not a concern at all because we make no bones right up front. It's like, look, this show is going to be heavily edited. Okay, so we're going to have
Mhm.
a conversation and we're going to go wherever we want to go. But if I ask you something and you don't like the answer or don't think it's the right place to go, just say that and we can delete the whole thing. And yeah, there's a lot of times for people where they go a little bit too far. And so you can just clip out a chunk from the center to tighten it up and make it more interesting. Or the other one is people have it's either time savers or confidence things, but they'll say things like, I'll say, like, what's the state of the industry? And they'll say, well, from what I see, I think that, and you can
Mm.
actually delete that whole chunk. Like, we know it's what you see. And, you know, don't just say that you think this, like, you stand behind it, that that's you, and you can jump right to the meat. And that keeps the conversation tight and rolling. And it basically just makes everybody sound smarter, which is the ultimate goal, that you've got that NPR sound.
As a podcast guest, you brought up a lot of really good points. And so one of the things that as a guest, as you were trying to determine if the fit is right, I think the preparedness of the host is a really good indicator as to whether or not it's going to be a solid episode that you're comfortable sharing. Um, I've been on quite a few podcasts, and I would say 9 times out of 10, I'll get some sort of prep email from the host or the production company ahead of time saying, this is what to expect. You've probably done this before, but here's a list of questions we're likely to cover. If you want to do a prep call, we can do that. And then they'll say, we'll share with you the episode before it goes live in case you want to, make any corrections or anything like that. And sort of like as a guest, knowing that you still have control over your story is a big deal. The other thing that I had to learn that I wasn't doing very well on my first couple of, outings on a podcast was getting my bio down like pretty quickly because people want to just move past that and get into the conversation. Chances are, if they're listening to your episode, they already know who you are. And so you don't need to spend, 5 minutes going through your pedigree of all of your accomplishments. It's boring. People want to move past it. They already know who you are. They're listening, they're engaged. So keep them engaged by moving into the thing. And then, you know, as a guest, telling jokes, that kind of thing, it's fine. But being too self-deprecating and sort of second guessing your own accomplishments does not make for good content. It makes you come across as really insecure, and people will start to question why they're listening to you in the first place of like, well, I know I'm a published author in the pharmacoepidemiology journal, but it's not really that big of a deal. I really just, straightened a couple of periods. Like, none of that's true. Like, I really am a published author in the pharmacoepidemiology journal. I can spell it and pronounce it, which is an accomplishment unto itself. And those are the things that, like, that's the reason why people are inviting me onto their shows, because there's accomplishments that I've had in my career that I need to just stand behind. I don't need to parade them around for the entire show, but I also don't need to make myself like, basically like undermine my own accomplishments just because it's weird to talk about yourself. It's weird to talk about yourself, let's be honest. For a lot of us, like, people are like, "Oh, tell me about what you're doing, what you're working on." Like, it can be really uncomfortable to toot your own horn, but that's the reason you're in these interviews, is so that you can do that. And if you're not comfortable doing that, then you definitely need those dry runs and those practices. Um, as a guest, asking for a list of questions ahead of time is always a good pro tip. And if the host is like, "Well, I don't have a set list of questions, but here are the topics we could talk about," to your point about that prep talk with the editing in the Google Doc, like, that's huge for people who aren't as comfortable, even if it's just, a podcast interview.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, and there's a bunch of things to unpack from that. As far as if you're the guest, then a lot of it just depends on how good the host is, right? How fast
Mhm.
does the host establish you as an expert, and then how fast does the host move into what's the pitch and the interesting thing. So, as somebody that wants to be on the show, when you're listening to their other episodes, you can see if they have the chops to do that. In a perfect world, you'd hear something just like the classic radio stuff you'll hear all the time of, if they start with a sizzle reel, right? If they start with a 30-second clip of the
Mhm.
guest saying something really provocative or way out there or crazy, like that really establishes as, hey, this is an interesting interview. And then another one is, a lot of shows will, the intro will roll. And then a lot of times the host will come on and say, hey, today's guest is so and so. This is what they do. But that's all recorded at a different time. Like, the guest didn't even have to sit through that.
Mhm.
Maybe they have the guest say, okay, tell us who you are. And then they have a mark that they hit of like, okay, here's where the questions actually start. And then when they go edit the show together, that's actually where you show up. Like, you're already warm and you're on the topic and they've introduced you. So, yeah, having an understanding of what you're expected to do before you get there is huge. Like, do I need a 30-second intro for myself? Do I need to talk for 2 minutes to establish myself? Or
Right.
do I, kick out with a huge story to blow things out? And the other one you said, always ask for the topics and questions in advance, because
Mhm.
even if they can only just give you like 4 topics, I always have a list of 4 or 5 related stories, for those topics when I sit down as a guest, because that way when they start talking, you can say, oh, yeah, that reminds me of the time. And, you're always using stories to illustrate the points, because it has to entertain, right? If you're just educating or reading out of your textbook, it doesn't stick, right? I mean, you could get
Mhm.
a Harvard or an MIT education with all of the YouTube videos of all this stuff out there, but nobody does that. Nobody sits through that stuff. You have to have a human hook. Otherwise, people just don't pay attention and they get lost.
Well, and that's one of the things that, as a guest, one of the things we want to cover is dealing with a bad podcast host. And so, I personally have never done like media training or anything like that. I know a lot of people who go on book tours have done media training. So basically, media training, for those who don't know, is basically a boot camp for being interviewed. That'll sort of like, it'll give you the skill set, the tools to, gracefully move away from topics you don't want to cover, how to answer things, succinctly, how to tell better stories. And so sometimes I'll be listening to an interview or a podcast and I'll think, huh, that person could have used some sort of a boot camp. But as a guest, you, even with all of the preparation in the world, if you get asked a curveball question. So, for example, and John, this is something we talked about a few years ago. questions not to ask female guests on your podcast. I've lost track, and thankfully it doesn't happen as much anymore because I think I've pretty much put my foot down that I will not do interviews that consist of asking me about any sort of, um, you know, bad experiences of being a woman in tech. Like, I won't do those interviews. I won't answer those questions because that's not the story that's important for me to be telling at this time. Um, and so if you're a guest and you're in an interview and they start asking those questions, I think one of the things that we don't realize is it's okay to say no and to stop the interview and say, this isn't working. This is probably not the best use of my time and your time because these are not questions that I think my audience wants to be hearing me answer, whatever the situation is. But you can try to redirect a host, and I've had to do that a few times as they start to get off track into things that either I'm not an expert in, which has definitely happened a few times. There's an assumption that I'm Chris Penn, and I'm not. Number one, I'm much, much taller than him. But you need to have the ability to sort of recognize this is going off topic. And you know what? It's okay as the guest. You're still in control of the story. Like, I may be sitting as a guest in Marketing Over Coffee, and Marketing Over Coffee is John Wall's podcast, but it's still my story that's being told. And so I need to speak up if it's not going in the right direction.
Yeah, and it's like running judo with that kind of stuff, because if the questions start veering off, you can just keep steering it back. And the host, if the host doesn't get the message after the third or fourth steer, well, that's fine because they're going to have to edit that up somehow and make it work, and it's going to be hell. So if they're smart, they will steal out of that. And then another big thing with that is to do your homework ahead of time. Yeah, is somebody worthy of your platform? It kind of gets played as everybody's like, oh, everybody has their show and, please consider me as a guest. But go in saying, no, like, I have this important story to share. And, you might not be worth my time. I'm not Tony Robbins, but I do only have, I can do 10 hours worth of podcasts a week. And if your show isn't in the top 1 million, you tell me why I should spend my time with you. Like, why should I answer your stupid questions? And so, when I get a show request that comes in, I always check Ahrefs, go see how many links the show has got. Has the website been up for 5 years, or did it just turn on last quarter and they're getting 2 visits a month? Look at the Apple reviews, see what they're doing over on Spotify, get a feel for the show and check their whole social presence and the discussions they're in. Is this person going to talk about you across all channels and get you some traffic? And is the thing going to get heard? Because And you might want to do, I know I do the same thing I kind of like have the 10 I want to hit, and I'll let 1 or 2 fall in there of people that I think, they have no audience or fans, but they're just going to be thrilled out of their mind to have you on and make a good show. And you never know too, maybe one of those will hit, or maybe you're just getting to spend some time with somebody who you might, be able to help, or they might be able to help you in the future with something else. So it's always fun to kind of make some time for those, but definitely make sure you're prioritizing the ones that are going to, get you in front of more people and is an audience that's proven to want to hear the kind of things that you talk about. And that, it's going to resonate. It's not going to be like, oh, you're just the person filling the seat this week.
I mean, you can speak to this. Every time I get an inbound request, I immediately send it to you and say, is this legit? Because I personally haven't been in this industry as long. I've now, been in the industry for a while, but I don't know people the same way that you and Chris and others who have been doing it in the industry longer than I have know people. And so I always, check with my trusted network first of, do you know this show? Do you know this host? And do I have anything that I need to be concerned with, for this kind of person? So there's definitely been a couple of shows a few years back that it's not that I regret doing them, but I wish I had done more homework on the host themselves because the experience being a guest wasn't that pleasant. It wasn't, and they weren't shows that I was particularly proud of. And that's just sort of my inexperience of being a podcast guest or some sort of interview guest of, it's okay to say, I don't think this is working. But also to your point, John, like, do your homework, be prepared. If you go online and you see that, John Wall, isn't the basketball player and you were really hoping to be on the basketball player's podcast, but instead you have John Wall of Marketing Over Coffee, you need to decide, does that fit my purpose? And that goes back to your original point, John, of the 5 Ps. Why am I doing this in the first place? Is it because I'm just excited that anybody's willing to talk to me? Or do I really have a story that I need to be telling to a specific audience?
Yeah, and we can hit some of the other ones here as far as platform and performance.
Mhm.
So you've done this guest thing now. Like, where do you want to? Is it working for you? What is it getting done? Some tips on that we always have. One is dedicated URL. If you
Mhm.
have your book is Time to Win, but you have maybe Time to Win with a two, number two, like TIME2 WIN.com. If you have a dedicated URL, you can actually see, hey, did we get any traffic over here for these kind of things? Giveaways are another one. Any podcast you're on, if you've got something you can give away, just say, hey, hit me up on social media or email me here. I recommend don't giving your email on a podcast. You're better off giving like a socials or LinkedIn
Mhm.
so that you can get them. But yeah, give away signed copy of the books or come get a free analysis of your site or what. For us, for Trust Insights, we've got another report going. You can get Chris's latest woefully incomplete prompt report,
AI book.
killing
Yeah.
it right now. So check that over at Trust Insights. Giveaways are perfect too because you'll get the feedback. One interesting thing though, and I've kicked this around a lot with other podcast networks, is it's not like ads in that when you are a guest on a show, first you're going to have to wait till the show drops. Some shows record that may be months
Mhm.
before it even hits the airwaves. And then the fact that a lot of episodes, it'll take 90 days to like get up to speed and get the full amount of clicks and downloads and listens that they normally get. The whole crowd doesn't just show up in the first hour, it's downloaded. So yeah, with a digital ad, in 3 days, you're done and you're not going to get another nickel out of it. I talk to vendors all the time that it's 3 years in. We have Ahrefs just got a lead last week. They haven't sponsored Marketing Over Coffee since like 2020. But it's these episodes are out there. People want to hear from Simon Sinek or Seth Godin or whoever or Debbie Millman, and there's a quote in there to go to the website, download a thing, and go. That's right, marketingovercoffee.com. Get your coffee hot, fresh delivered. Top 20 episodes and bios. Sign up for the text line. Follow us on LinkedIn.
But that's a really good point because we're into the how do I measure my performance as a guest? And you have to be prepared to give people some kind of a call to action in order for them to do something that's measurable. And so, you can look at the podcast episode as a whole and say how many people listened, but that might be completely out of your control because, the networks that this podcast is published on may not be the networks where your particular audience is. And so, you need to be sharing the episodes that you're proud of. To your point, John, giveaways, really easy to remember URLs like, if you shortened it to moc.com, people can remember that. Marketingovercoffee.com, also super easy to remember. Um, and push people so that you can see, okay, I did this thing and it brought people to my download page, to my website, to whatever it is. So I recently, to toot my own horn a little bit, I recently did a podcast as a guest with my good friend Brooke Sellis. I did the marketing agency show, which she has through Social Media Examiner. And because of that episode, I got an invitation to speak at an event. And I got a bunch of new followers on LinkedIn who reached out to me specifically with a message of, I heard you on Brooke's podcast. And I'm really interested in learning more about you and your company. And so for me, mission accomplished. I got some very tangible, measurable things out of that. I got better awareness and I get to continue the conversation on stage at Social Media Marketing World in 2024, which, is kind of cool.
Yeah, no, isn't and that's something that we see all the time. We joke about the buying a private jet podcast. Like if it only has 4 listeners and one buys a jet, that's the most successful podcast of all time with your 4 downloads. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
You don't need to be Joe Rogan. You just need to get some people over the line. One thing to help out with success with those programs too, as you're doing those, is make sure that your marketing and sales teams are fully aware that they have those programs. In fact, a
Mhm.
great thing to do is let them use that as a giveaway. If there's a show that's covering the topic that you are involved with, have the sales and marketing people say, hey, you want to learn more about what this is, go listen to this podcast over here, 30 minutes. Because there's a lot of sponsors we have where, the sales and marketing teams are just like, we get leads from that. We like expect a lead or two. So
Mhm.
sponsors may not even care about downloads or any of that stuff. They're just like, we're getting our 2 or 3 deals a quarter. Like, that's awesome. That's well worth the money we're paying. We're going to do that. So it's funny. Now, and the really weird one, you'll get the devil's deal where, you get these podcasts where you don't like the host or you don't like the audience, but it's a good fit for what you're doing. And so you have to wade in there and figure out like, okay, how are we going to do this with a guest who's going to beat on a host who's going to beat on me, or,
Mhm.
who knows where it's going to go, or, they have a reputation for asking, questions that are way off base. You just have to kind of, get your best padding on and, go show your judo, see if you can throw and redirect and, still get your message out there, because sometimes it's worth taking the hits.
Well, and I think that's where, to your point about preparation is key. And so, you know, making sure that here's the exact story that I want to be telling on this show, and I'm not going to deviate from it. Putting up those guardrails, saying to the host ahead of time, this is the story I'm going to be telling. I will not answer other questions, or you can try, but it's not going to go anywhere. You just need to stand your ground and say, this is the story I'm going to be telling. Period. Done. And then you can say at the end, great. If you enjoyed that, you can learn more at trustinsights.ai/prompt sheet, which is really easy to remember. And so for people listening to this episode or watching this live stream, our call to action today would be go to our website and download our free uh, prompt sheet, which tells you how to assemble really strong prompts for generative AI. And so we would be able to measure the referral traffic coming into that particular page to see where are people coming from. Were they coming from, this live stream, or were they coming from something else, or replays, or, we could measure the effectiveness in that way. But to your point about just sometimes you have to suck it up, it's really hard because, to your point, they may be the wrong host, but they're the right audience. And so you have to decide, is it worth it? Is it worth me possibly doing any kind of damage to my brand or my reputation to take this risk? And that's a question only you and your team can answer.
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of like more advanced level stuff, but we see this like especially with panels at trade shows.
Mhm.
Ultimately you kind of get to a point where like you might be a lot better off picking a fight than trying to explain something to your host there, because a fight will get you heat and action, and especially if you're on the right. Because there are a lot of people who are fine with like, I'm going to take I want to create a fight under any circumstance because I know it generates heat. And so they're, make outrageous claims and say ridiculous and stupid stuff. And if you're the one that drops the banhammer and, calls them out as inappropriate or completely out of right field and wrong, that actually
Mhm.
can do you well. You'd mentioned another thing too, I wanted to loop back on, was humor too, is another thing.
Mhm.
An easy key, if you're not comfortable with humor or you're not sure, which is really, unless you've road tested it, you're not sure whether you're not sure or not. You have to figure out if something works. But an easy hack is to always have the jokes as part of and involving the content itself.
Mhm.
So if you are talking about a survey and you're like, oh yeah, one of the guys fell down the stairs, it's not a joke that's unrelated to the content. So if it's a bad joke, people will just blow right through it. They'll just ignore it
Right.
and maybe not even think it's a joke. Whereas if you try to just like grab some random joke off the web and plug it into your thing, like that's where you get the really awkward, weird moments that you can't recover from. You look horrible. So if
Mhm.
you want to experiment with humor, keep it in line with the content, and then it's pretty much foolproof. And if the jokes crash and burn.
Yeah. No, and I think that that's solid because I've definitely listened to some episodes. I've probably done it myself too, where you feel the need to keep the story going and suddenly you just make up a joke or like a funny anecdote on the spot and it just falls flat to crickets. And it's like that is the worst feeling. Um, I think the big thing is just to be genuine and be yourself, and, don't try to concoct a persona and, these, really, detailed stories that never happened because they sound more interesting than what really happened. To your point about the airplane, the what is it? The jet engine?
The private jet.
The private jet podcasts, there's gonna be someone out there who resonates, and it might be the right person who your story resonates with. Back to measurement, the thing that occurs to me too is that if you're using social listening tools, then you can start to see if the conversation that you're having is having any sort of impact on, the different social platforms where your episode is being shared. If there's a transcript included. Chris actually last week on our live stream, which you can get older episodes at trustinsights.ai/YouTube. We talked about using generative AI to repurpose content. And one of the things that we talked through was repurposing your episodes as a guest on other people's shows to pull the transcript, to pull the video, to repurpose it. And so those are other ways that you can make the most of being a guest. You can measure the success of the interview by your ability to repurpose the content in a meaningful way. So if it was like just a crap interview and you're like, I would never want to repurpose this, then, it's a crap interview. But if it's something like, the talk that I had with Brooke a few weeks ago, I'm going to get a lot of mileage out of that, which to me is the mark of a really, Brooke did her homework. We had a prep meeting, but also, I, as the guest, came prepared because I knew what she was going to ask. And I wanted to make sure I was making really impactful statements in a very short amount of time, which is not easy to do. And they didn't all work.
Yeah, right. Well, and that's another part of the dance that when the host is putting the show together and you as the guest is that you could have it fully scripted and there's nothing wrong with that too. Like you would know that every minute we're here, we're going to hit points and we're going to be on the mark. Or you can start to let the conversation be more organic. But yeah, you totally have a risk with that of like, you could have 3 minutes that's just garbage that you're going to throw in the trash can. And if this is
Mhm.
somebody important that you've only got 25 minutes with, losing 3 minutes is going to kill you. So
Right.
that's like when people are making TV shows, there's not a minute that's not planned because they're spending money and the meter's running. Now in podcasting, you can run long and it's nobody cares. There's, barely an extra nickel spent. But yeah, you kind of have to make that trade-off of like, do I think I can find some weird gem that nobody's ever talked to this person about that's educational, entertaining, and funny? Or are we just going to hear some weird story about their pet iguana that, is not going to make the final show?
Yeah.
You could have to do that on the fly and let it rip.
I would say as a guest, it's never a bad idea to have some of those pet iguana stories prepared. Because I would say a lot of times, to your point, you sort of have the 3 acts of marketing over coffee. And aside from the work that you're doing, the storytelling, hosts a lot of times want to dig into who you are as a person. And so be prepared to answer like, what's a fun fact about you? Or, what's a, anecdote from your childhood? Or, what was the first pet you ever had? Like be prepared with some of those, like have them in your back pocket. Even if you tell them over and over again on every single podcast, that's okay because you're going to be hitting a different audience every single time. And so it's okay to tell the pet iguana that you used to put a harness on and walk down the street, and people would line up on their sidewalks and, have their, flies ready to feed the iguana because it was such a cool part of the day. And then the ice cream truck ran down the street and almost hit the iguana. And then, oh my gosh, you realize you probably shouldn't be walking an iguana in the street in the first place. Have that story ready because it's going to be a really interesting contrast to the work that you're doing. But make sure you know what that story is. Don't make it up on the spot like I just did, unless I
Yeah.
did a really good job and then it's a true story.
Having and easy go-tos are, the last couple books you read or the last couple movies you watched,
Mhm.
some kind of culture thing that you've done. But yeah, it is funny. And that is one great thing with marketing over coffee stuff we've seen is, you have somebody speaking for 20 minutes about some marketing analytics thing. And then you're like, what are your hobbies? And they come out with something that you totally didn't expect out of right field. That's, fun or funny or interesting, or you never thought this person would be into that kind of stuff. And that can make for, entertaining interview. It makes it for something fun to listen to.
Or you could do what Carrie Gorgone and I did and turn it into a whole separate podcast of the fun hobbies that people have outside of work. Because what we realized was that people, that you were interviewing on things like Marketing Over Coffee would also then like slip in like, oh, and by the way, like I've been to space. And you're like, well, that's a conversation we don't have time to have, but I definitely want to dig into. Um, but so as a guest, you're an interesting person. There's a reason why people want to talk to you. So just be confident in that. And then you can measure it by, if you give them a call to action, John, to your point, have a giveaway, drive them back to your website. Those are some of the best ways to measure. And then other ways to measure is, are you then invited onto other podcasts or interviews because of the show that you did, because the content was that good?
Always hits. Yeah. I've got a copy of Seth Godin's new book. Mention it on social. You can have it. We'll throw that out as a giveaway there, just as a treat for anybody that's muscled through it today.
All right, John, any final thoughts for people who are either new to being a guest or have been a guest for a long time and maybe just need a refresher?
Yeah, no, just get out and do it, right? And have your cheat sheet of the points. At the end of every interview, you should be able to look at your list and say, okay, yeah, I hit those 3 key points. Maybe it completely went off the rails and it's going to be a disaster, but at least we did what we set out to do.
I think that's solid. Know your story. Know what you want to tell. All right, John, until next time.
Here we go. We're trying the exit. Let's pull the rip.
Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and a weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.